You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Get a bellyache. I got a duty right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I am Urza Master. Here, as always, with me is my good buddy Lord Uther. And joining us today, we've got RJ Macready, a.k.a. Aaron, a special guest with us to talk, I think, arguably, one of the best follow-ups to what, for Lord Uther and some, was a much maligned bit of a misstep for the Star Trek franchise. And, of course, we're talking Star Trek 6. This is Episode 6, The Undiscovered Country. And this is our first guest host. So, in a way, this is an undiscovered country for us. And our wall has come down in space, a.k.a. we are broadcasting over the internets, which is a infinitesimal space. Ha ha ha, I'm getting all my jokes in right away.
You're doing great.
So, picking up where we left off, Star Trek V kind of leaves us with this sort of, we just got done with an episode of Star Trek feeling. So, I think the best way to walk into Star Trek VI is to take in the immediate change that, of course, you get right off the bat, and that is Captain Sulu, captain of the Excelsior. I think, all other parts of the movie aside, this is the most long overdue in Star Trek errata to date. So we're talking 89. It's about time Captain Sulu happens, and I gotta say, the first time I watched it when I was really young, and you guys can weigh in on this, that moment for me when he's like, "Shields!" was, heart-stopping. I really thought they were killing Sulu in the first couple minutes of this movie. It gripped me. Even this time I was like, oh, all these years later, special effects looking as cheesy as they do these days, I don't know. Maybe it's because now that some of the other original cast members are gone, I subconsciously are like, we can't lose Sulu, we can't lose George Takei. And then he's in this life-threatening situation on TV, and I'm like, no. So I want to hear from Aaron. He's our guest today. What did you think the first time you saw this? Take it away.
It's so funny because in addition to watching the films, I had collected the novelizations of the original Star Trek films with the original cast. And going back to as far as, I think, The Search for Spock, they had been sort of teasing this in the book. They were either, which was supposed to be an adaptation of the screenplays and so forth. So whether these things were originally part of the script and just got jettisoned for whatever reason or so forth, but going back to Search for Spock, they linked Sulu to an impending captain with the Excelsior. Like that was going to be, and in fact, as I remember the novelization of Trek 3, once they returned to space dock, he was supposed to leave the ship and go and take the captaincy of the Excelsior right then and there, but because of the drama of the Genesis planet and everything, they're kind of like, sorry, we're going to give it to this other guy, Captain Harriman, instead. Maybe next time. And that played through in the novelizations to 3 and to 4. Obviously, with 5, they just kind of left him as the navigator on the Enterprise. So when I first saw it, like you say, it was kind of, for me, it was kind of like catching up. Like, oh, finally, here he is. He got his, he got his posting. He got the main chair there, and so it wasn't so much a surprise to me. It was just sort of a sense that this was where they had kind of steered the character towards all along. And I'd always liked Sulu, as with the original series and in the other films. I always found him to always have a quick quip and be the steady hand at the helm. So I was very pleased to see it.
You know, I've never thought about the opening scene that they might kill him. I don't know why that never came to mind, that could have possibly happened. So now that you're saying that, I'm looking at that a little bit differently. You know, and we kind of brought this up before. Like, I still say right after 6, he should have had his own series. It should have been the Captain Sulu series. You know, we've kind of had that discussion, because I think if someone could have carried it, it could have been George Takei. I think he could have done that. But with that being said, I think he has a couple of lines in that movie that stick out. I'll hold off on my favorite line in the movie completely until we get a little deeper in, because there's a line that he says that I repeat it with my buddy Scott all the time. But that idea of him, just like he's got that presence, and I think he establishes that in that shot, right? Like he, you know, turn us into the wave, and, you know, all these different things he's saying. And I even like, you know, to RJ Macready's point there, I like the part where he adds in a quip, because the communicator says, or whatever, the ops, or you know what I'm talking about, the help me, communication person.
Yep.
She's like, should we report this? And he goes, are you kidding? You know, and it's like he gets that quip in, right?
I laughed so hard at that. That was such a great line.
But to again, very Sulu-y, right?
Very Sulu.
And just to see him in charge of that ship, I think it was just something, a cool dynamic to add to that film.
Yeah. What I also thought was cool, and I think may easily go overlooked on the Excelsior, is Grace Lee Whitney is the tactical officer. So you may remember her as Yeoman. Now her name escapes me. I know the actress's name.
Yeoman Rand. Janice Rand.
Kirk's Yeoman on the original series. Yeoman Rand. Yeah, Janice Rand is there and looked amazing in the original series. It still looks great in '89. Just a testament to her. But I think it's just endlessly hysterical and so Sulu and so George Takei. And of course, he didn't know this necessarily about himself at the time, but just the delicate little tea he's having on the bridge. And I think back to that episode where everybody on the Enterprise gets that like drunken disease from the water on that one planet, and he's like, "I'm really sweaty. Should we go to the gym?" And like, the whole time I'm like, come on, man. Like, it would have been so cool to see a gay Captain Sulu traversing through space. He didn't even have to get into conflict, but to see him study nebulas, I'd have watched the shit out of that show. I'm just saying. A Captain Sulu show would have been great for so many reasons, but especially, I just love George Takei, and I think that would have been such a cool show in the 90s and such a groundbreaking opportunity that they really did miss. But then, of course, moving forward in the movie, we find out explosion on Praxis. We're talking Klingon neutral zone. And, you know, they've been skirting around these Klingon villains for all of the movies so far. You know, they've had them here and there, and you just sort of know that eventually something was going to bubble over. You know, in Star Trek V, they were kind of, you know, they were sort of intimidating, but they were kind of, you know, they've always kind of been yutzy. Like, they were never a serious threat or anything like you remember them being, other than, of course, Star Trek III, which is where they get to shine for a very brief moment. But even then, it's like a rogue Klingon, you know, who's breaking the rules. I mean, this kind of brings those Klingons back to a much more sort of bloodthirsty era. But, of course, they're in crisis, too. So, you know, we get hit with this Praxis moon exploded. They don't want anybody to know about it. They say we don't need help. Of course, I was growing up at the time with Next Generation, and I knew Worf, who I'm sure we'll talk about shortly here. You know, I'm thinking these Klingons, like, why are they so big and badass? Like, they never really were... Next Generation, they were, like, sort of badass, but they were never really, like, super intimidating. And just the approach that they take to this kind of delicate, you know, hey, we're here to help. Clearly you need help. And then, of course, we find out very shortly thereafter that the reason they need help is there's all this pollution as a result of this explosion. And, you know, basically the Klingon Empire's getting ready to fall. corollary to what's going on in '89. You know, the late '80s, and the wall coming down. Now it's in space. I thought it was a little overdone, the whole Soviet corollary to me. I know that Star Trek is always about what's going on in the world and forecasting what a good future should look like, but they kind of hit you on the nose with it in this movie in the beginning. I think the intrigue takes you elsewhere later. But I think even as a kid, I recognized right away, because I grew up after the wall fell, after, I was 3 or 4 when the Soviet Union dissolved. So I didn't know the Soviets, I didn't know the Red Scare. And it was always kind of a joke to me. I grew up with Terminator 2. We're like, aren't they our friends now? Well, yeah, they are, but actually computers want to kill everybody. So I didn't have that background. So it always seemed kind of cheesy. I'm thinking Soviets, Rocky IV, Soviets, Star Trek 6. They're all just kind of these big puffed up nobodies. But the truth be told, and I think that's where Star Trek 6 comes back and does a good service instead of a disservice, where I think Star Trek V got a little off the rails, is that they do kind of add this element of spies and intrigue, and there's a lot of layers here. It's not necessarily there's a big catastrophe and this is going to make peace happen, which I think is the initial hesitation by Kirk, is that it's I don't trust these Klingons. I know them. I know even when things are in the rough, this is where they're headed. So that's my thought on that. Now, I'd love to hear what your guys' perspective was, because you saw it in the era and had much more acute background than I did.
Go ahead, Aaron. I'm listening.
Well, I mean, a lot of that credit goes to co-writer director Nicholas Meyer, who I'm sure you guys have talked up in previous episodes. The best writing, the most natural, if you want to call it comedy, and interactions with the cast in between each other came when he was, running the ship, sitting in the captain's chair himself. Obviously, Star Trek II, one of the high water marks of the entire original 6 films, and what he was able to do to course correct after the grandeur of Robert Weiss's Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and really making that film, Star Trek II, about relationships, picking up those threads in 4 with more of a lighthearted time travel romp in San Francisco. Something that they tried to replicate with 5, but not having Nicholas Meyer around, you can see the difference just in getting a good writer and a good steady eye behind the camera there. And in this one, as we're talking about, the Cold War correlation at the time and all of that, yes, there, you could call it, a little heavy, a little on the nose, I think is a good descriptor there. But what Meyer does, like you say, by shifting the story then to be more of a cloak and dagger, spy, espionage, in some moments it actually comes off like a really paranoid 1970s conspiracy thriller. I mean, it's it's elements of the Parallax View or 3 Days of the Condor or those films back then where it was kind of who do I trust? Do I go to this meeting in the underground parking garage, and get the scoop on Watergate? I mean, that was for him, and what he did with 2, kind of moving slightly away from Gene Roddenberry's original vision. He made Star Trek 2, he made it all like naval ships, like it was Horatio Hornblower, I believe he's been quoted as saying that's what he wanted. He wanted bosuns piping in people as they entered the bridge, and he wanted the torpedo battles between Reliant and Enterprise to be like, ships at sea with cannons going back and forth amongst each other. And so, like I say, I think what he did with this one, he frames it for the Trek audience and the non-Trek audience as, okay, so we're holding up a mirror to current affairs, and here's our obvious parallels. We've got environmental concerns, we've got the political concerns with the wall coming down, and we have to help our allies. And even in that first scene, first couple of scenes with the crew before they rendezvous with Chancellor Gorkon and everybody, he allows their prejudices, their distrust. It's something that I think Gene Roddenberry is on the record as saying, this is not, I don't want Star Trek to be a dark place and full of bitter divisions and so forth. This is the 23rd century. We're supposed to have gotten past all of that. But I think it makes for richer drama and richer storytelling and richer characters to have Kirk saying, I will never trust them, they killed my son, and having Chekhov and Scotty and everyone make disparaging comments before they come on board for dinner and so forth. It's something that we recognize. I guess it's a little more, it grounds us. It's a little more human, and I give all the credit to Nicholas Meyer for kind of not being shying away from that, not trying to give us this utopian, perfectly sculpted vision of it, and instead giving us real human foibles and things like that.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't that the original? So even if let's go back to the original series, weren't Klingons supposed to be the Russians? I mean, wasn't that the idea behind it? I thought it was, or
it was a pretty easy stand-in. Yes, I mean for that at the time.
Right, and so growing up with that, yeah, you're right. It's in your face. It reflected the day. I agree with all that, but I think it does a couple things, right? First of all, I think it shows. I mean, here they're sitting at the conference table and they're waiting for the liaison to walk in, and it's Spock, right? And Spock's going to propose this, and Kirk's like, I like that conflict right off the bat in a sense.
Yeah. That's
his best friend, right? And he wants to save these people, and here Kirk is like, let them die, right? Like he was all about. He was going with the old school idea of let them just kind of burn out. Who cares? They've been bad for us all this time. Let them die. And Spock is trying to be this voice of reason. So the conflict wasn't that huge, but you're setting up two best friends with completely different ideas. And of course, Spock's is based in logic. And Kirk's is based on not just the emotion of fighting the Klingons forever, but they killed my son, which is what we've been kind of waiting for. That 5 does kind of nothing with, which I think you could have done something with it, but that's a whole other story. That could have been a part of it, but finally we're getting this. The bastards killed my son. This is awful. We can't trust these people. But that's kind of but that's the old school feeling because all the other animals there were feeling the same way. And I think now that I'm 50, because you're such a youngin' there, Cody, but being older. I can relate to the idea of how can I let that go when that's all I've known for such a long time, and growing up in that age of, and we'll talk about, the Cold War, nuclear threats and all these other things. Yes, were Aaron and I a little more on the tail end of it? We probably were. But it was still there. And so this idea now that you got to make friends with your enemy, which is going to set up Worf for Next Generation, so I can see that happening too, but it does kind of speak to Trek, because these are people you're supposed to hate, and now we're going to bring them in, and we're going to be friends, and we're going to make nice. So
at the
yeah,
time,
it was a little dark.
Sorry,
please go ahead.
At the time,
you're good.
This was released in December of '91. In fact, I noted when I was just doing a little research, it opened on December 6th, 1991, 12 years to the day, December 6th, 1979, that Star Trek The Motion Picture had come into theaters. So you're talking about a 12-year, 6 movies, 12 years, and they didn't just, pop them out one at a time. There were some gaps in there and course corrections and all of that, but basically that's what they were talking about. As this was coming into theaters, over on the TV side, everyone was freaking out and getting excited because Leonard Nimoy was doing his famous 2-part appearance as Ambassador Spock. I think it was called Unification.
Right.
And that actually aired on, back then, you can look this up, Star Trek fans, on syndicated television, well back when, well before streaming. And there was this, this was the big final, first, I think he was the first cast member to, come over and bless the new show. And it was a big deal. It was a two-parter. And he had, obviously he'd stepped off the bridge of the Enterprise and he was in this new role. So when I'm watching that opening briefing and he comes in, I've got that in the back of my head saying, oh, so here's the genesis of Spock. Now he's going to be more of a diplomat, more of a problem solver, sort of a, Starfleet UN type of, role for him. And so that's, kind of all cross-pollinating there at the same time.
Sets that story up. That's a good point. Never thought
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, it's interesting how, and I actually forgot about that point. I'm glad you brought that up with reunification. I mean, to this, I just recently rewatched all of Next Generation, and that episode still is just like, it's just such a shocking storyline. And back in the day, I remember when it was weekly episodic TV that it was must see, you couldn't miss it. I mean, that was a huge deal. That cliffhanger at the end of I think it was season 3 or 4, one of the two. I can't remember exactly. I mean, it just leaves you like, oh, what? What is Spock doing on Romulus? And I love that they set that up in here, that he's transitioning away from that spacefaring science officer into really a greater character that he's, slowly been becoming, through his death and rebirth, and he's beginning this new journey, which ultimately splits him away from Kirk. And I think that's the toughest pill to swallow of this movie, is that even though they remain close friends, of course, this is they're literally, this is the end of the line for everyone. And I think DeForest Kelley was on the Farpoint episode, so I do think Spock was like the second or third cast member to appear, but he was definitely like the biggest name.
Right.
Because DeForest Kelly's in the episode for like a minute talking to Data.
That's right.
And he
He's
accuses him
walking
of being
around
Vulcan.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, comparing him to being a Vulcan, yeah.
Right. And I think James Doohan was on, I think he was the third one. I think he was on season 5 or something.
Yeah, he was on after Nimoy, yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, while Next Generation is happening, like, that all these characters have gone their separate ways. So how do they get there? What is the straw that breaks the camel's back? And I think that's a great segue into the incident with Gorkon, which it's interesting that he looks a lot like that Earthling on Nimbus 3. David Warner is just, and may he rest in peace, a great actor. Everything I've ever seen him in, I'm like, damn, what a performance. Even in Star Trek V.
Twin Peaks, yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah, so, I think it was really interesting that, and again, I want to bring up the darkness of this movie because it is very contrary to really all the other movies, even Wrath of Khan, which was comparatively dark in a sense, but a lot more naval, big action. But they put this in this tense situation, which could have had some real comedy, and you kind of get the sense that the crew is trying to bring some levity to the situation, and the Klingons are this hard edge they keep falling against. And it's very Shakespearean, and I love that they quote Shakespeare so often in this movie. It harkens back to Ricardo Montalban and Khan, and I think that's why, because it's this elevated. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give it this term. It's this elevated literary sense of the writing of this movie, where they are reaching for such great heights, which I think in the era, and I know this from my folks, I think in the era people thought of Star Trek as kind of this cheesy sci-fi type thing that they remember from the original series. And when you see some of the movies, Star Trek 4, I love it to death, but it's kind of campy. It's there's a lot of humor. It's a romp. It's fun. There's a lot of heavy subjects, and they do a really nice job. But it's not, it's not Shakespearean. And I think this really sets up this and I think of Hamlet specifically, but I think it sets up this really dark situation between these two rival forces where you really don't know what's going to happen to either side. You know, are they going to obliterate each other? Are they going to end up working together? Is there going to be subterfuge that ends up in most of them dying and only a few people being able to tell the tale? You know, because at this point, Next Generation, which is the only continuation of Star Trek at this point, if I'm not mistaken,
That's right.
you know, the only people we know for sure that survive are McCoy and Spock. The other cast members, we have no idea what happened. So the nice thing is there wasn't enough of them appearing on Next Generation that it left this very open-ended. Like, it could have, in this moment, around this dinner table, it could have been the first domino to fall, and only a couple people who we've seen on Next Generation so far might make it. So again, I'm looking at it from the eyes of who's going to die in this movie, you know, because this is the last one. And of course, you know, we'll get further on now, but I want to talk about the special effects with the raid on Gorkin's ship, because I hate to say it, but I remember even back in the day, the Klingon blood looked super cheesy to me. Now, I know that effect in 1990, or whenever they had it programmed, was extremely difficult to achieve. But what struck me was, as bad as the blood looked, everything else about that sequence was gorgeous. The anti-gravity, the spacesuit get-ups with the gravity boots looked incredible. They looked like something out of Tron, but with better, brighter colors. And the Klingon ship, like, you know, we're used to the bird of prey that we saw in you know, the prior movies. It's so much more spacious. It still feels like a warship, but it's like a classy warship. I don't know. They just, the scenery in these shots was just so incredible. And then the special effects really let me down. So what did you guys think? I'm dying to know, because this has always bothered me about this movie.
Aaron, I'm just going to keep defaulting to you, so I'm going to let you go ahead and I'll play.
Well,
I'll play cleanup. Go ahead.
And it's funny because to take a step briefly back and just again talking about the special effects. So they brought back, after having used ILM, you know, George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic, you know, company, on 2, 3, and 4. They stepped away for it for cost reasons on 5, and that proved to be dismal. So ILM was back in the saddle with 6, and I have to tell you, just a real quick rewind. For the first 2 or 3 minutes of this movie, as I'm sitting there watching it in a huge screen in Los Angeles, I'm just praying that please don't look terrible, please don't look cheesy. And when Excelsior, like I say, when Sulu turns it into the wave, and Excelsior, you know, leaps out of the Praxis shockwave and you know, does a brief flyby the camera, just like the Star Treks we remembered, you know, like I say, shots of the Enterprise and Reliant and Excelsior from the previous ones. I was just, everything just unclenched. I'm like, oh, thank God, you know, the pros are back. I mean, you know, that's just something that my 19-year-old head was thinking. In terms of the blood globules, and then a little bit later with Martia and her shape-shifting on camera, it also helps to know, again, like, this was, at the time, in 1991 terms, this was like the pioneering stuff that ILM had been working on for the last 2 or 3 years, the morphing, if you will, which earlier that summer had been shown to, you know, terrific effect in Terminator 2, you know, pioneered on Willow in 1988, and those blood, you know, those big purple blood, you know, bubbles and so forth, that would later go on, you know, they'd start doing things a couple of months later, I guess, with the Lawnmower Man and things like that. So this was like as state-of-the-art as they could possibly get it in 1991. Now, to your credit, it does look a little goofy, particularly now when you're removed from all of that. But at the time, I remember thinking, oh, look at that. Like, look at those little blood bubbles going, doo, 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 doo. And you're reminded of, like, the water tentacle in the abyss and just other things that, you know, so I'm sort of removed from the moment of the movie as I'm watching it thinking, oh, look what ILM did. That's kind of cool. But I mean, I was just relieved that we got spaceships that actually were in 3 dimensions and so forth, and phaser effects and other things of that nature that kind of reset us back on the right path as far as that. So that one of the biggest joys for me with this was seeing ILM back doing those effects with the Bird of Prey and with the Excelsior and the Enterprise.
Yeah, to just kind of back up a little bit, I love the tension of an experience. First of all, they have a full crew finally. It's not a skeleton crew like it was before. Second of all, the ship's actually working properly. Scotty's not wiring it up, even though it's kind of like its final voyage, but whatever. Urza and I, Cody and I have gone over this a few times about how all of a sudden there was no ship and then there's a new Enterprise, but that's all fine. I do like the tension of an experienced crew not knowing what the hell's going on when those torpedoes are sent off, right? Which is going to set up the effects that we're talking about. And I love the chaos of that. And Scotty's like, we counted them, they're here, but no, it says that we launched them. And there's just all this stuff going on. They're trying to figure it out. And then for Kirk to stand down. So I might be jumping ahead a little bit because I know we're talking about special effects, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think that's first of all, General Chang, which I mentioned when we talked about 5, is the perfect foil for Kirk, right?
Absolutely.
Combat-wise, leadership-wise, speaking-wise, presence.
Looks like a pit bull.
Yeah, and just finally someone that can kind of, again, stand up to Kirk in a sense. So I love how all that
has that reputation of sometimes he might chew off a little scenery, and I actually thought with his Chang, and I recognized this at the time, not just now as I'm older, he underplays this role significantly. A lot of his best dialogue is delivered almost at room temperature, or even almost at a whisper, which makes it even more menacing. I mean, he's not Eric Bana in the later films, screaming at all decibels and so forth. I mean, here is Christopher Plummer, just like this elegant serpent, just playing with Kirk and the crew. Even at the dinners, with Gorkin and the others, like he's a real charmer and a real snake, and you instinctively don't like him, and you're worried about him because he's got that coiled menace.
That's a great point. Like, that is such an excellent point about him delivering his lines and how yes,
There's
something's up.
There's a scene. I think it's after a little bit ahead of where we are in terms of the story, but there's a scene where the daughter is on the bridge and she's doing something, and he just is like, and like sort of wags his finger at her and like corrects her or challenges whatever she. I wish I remembered the exact exchange, but I mean, it's as if he had like slapped her across the face, and he didn't. He just like, they killed your father. Don't ever forget that kind of a, it stuck out at me. It's like, wow, this guy is, watch out. Don't turn your back on this fellow.
Yeah, and again, almost like a Kirkish presence. All those Klingons look up to him. They all want to follow him, very similar to Kirk. So I love that dynamic that was set up. I love the special effects in this movie. And again, yes, we are 15 years your senior there, Cody. So for us, what we're seeing then pales in comparison to now. But I also think 5 was such a shit show in terms of the special effects that I probably could have gone in there with some models and flown them around, and it might have looked better. So with ILM coming back in, which I always thought that was interesting too. Here's ILM that has done all the Star Wars stuff, and now they do the Star Trek stuff too. I always thought that was kind of interesting, but that's who you'd want to do, especially back then, right, Aaron? I mean, if you wanted someone to do special effects,
right?
You were going to ILM. I mean,
right.
That's the cream of the crop, right?
Weta and Digital Domain, which kind of was born out of Terminator 2, was just starting to get their feet tracked. But yes, ILM from 77 to basically now, the very beginning of the 90s was, that's who you were looking at. And I mean, you guys have probably, gone over this and so forth. The single most galling thing is that the Enterprise, even going back to the motion picture and so forth, the original model, it was just such a gorgeously updated, beautiful starship, with all of its grace and power and so forth. And I mean, I couldn't, I couldn't get enough of seeing that, whether it was, clean and pristine and flying out of space dock, or battered and beat up, and after Khan got through with them. And so in 5, like you say to Eric, like when they chose to do rear projection and just these sort of very flat, two-dimensional shots, as a Star Trek fan, I just felt robbed. I'm like, that's not what the Enterprise is supposed to look like. And here, I think the first time we actually see the ship is when it leaves space dock. He has Valeris take her out at 1/4 impulse, and she tries to correct him, and he says, "You heard the order, Lieutenant." And they have a shot of it, space dock, the model, and then they have the Enterprise just coming out. It's just, they used it in the trailer, and it was just, I'm like, look at her, she's terrific. So.
Yeah, again, for me, huge upgrade. So I was on board with those special effects. Yeah, the morphing stuff, I agree, that looked a little off. I would even say back then it looked a little off. But again, if you had seen, because Terminator 2 came out first, right, Aaron?
It was like literally 3 or 4 months before this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you see Terminator 2, and talk about again, youngin, Cody, you young guy. It was so mind blowing to see Terminator 2 with what they had. I mean, what James Cameron was doing with that. I think anything else would have. Any kind of morphing back then would have probably paled in comparison, but I definitely can see where we're kind of going with that. I didn't mean to take us off course with saying all those other things, but about the just with Chang and everything, but a huge upgrade that needed to be done for this story and for it to be successful. That's where I was eventually going with that whole point.
Definitely. And I wanted to get back to the idea of Chang being a snake in the grass, because I think the beauty of this film and the writing is that there were multiple snakes in the grass, of course, and we find that out through, the trial and through the investigation back on the Enterprise while Kirk and McCoy are off having their adventures in Alaska. I always thought Kim Cattrall was always a boyhood crush of mine, especially as Valeris. But I hate to say it, but she almost acts that character to the point where it gives it away. Like immediately when you meet Valeris in this movie, I didn't trust her off the bat.
Really?
I for what it's worth, I don't know if she was too pretty to be a Vulcan. Maybe. And I say that in the nicest way possible, but it was just like, I always think of Kirk when there's a pretty, or an attractive woman in the scene, Vulcan or not, Kirstie Alley, there's a sex attraction there. And I didn't feel that whatsoever with Valeris.
Oh, no, there wasn't.
Now, of course, we have to consider Kirk is much older now. Things probably don't work the same way, but there's sexual tension later in the movie, so it brings me back to that tension being completely absent, and not like in Star Trek 3 where I think it was between David and Kirstie Alley's character that was not played by Kirstie Alley. I don't know why this
Robin Curtis
Savick. Yeah, Robin Curtis. So they kind of set that up a little bit, I think, but there was still some tension there. But to have it, to me, it was completely absent, and it wasn't between her and Spock. So it's like, I'm not pointing this out as a flaw with the movie, but to me, it always tipped the hand. And I was like, well, wait a minute, something's not quite right here. I don't know what yet, but that was my first take on Valeris, and then Chang to me. I don't know. I get back to what Kirk said. I'll never trust Klingons. You knew Chang was a villain. Like, there was no hiding that. You knew he was the bad guy. But how bad was he? And who were all the bad people around him? I think his character and the way he played it overshadowed kind of the immediate circle that became the cabal behind the assassination, and everything that was going forward was setting up Kirk and McCoy for assassination. But, you know, Valeris, I think, was like, you kind of saw that the puzzle wasn't perfectly together there. And whether that was intentional to kind of, you know, avoid too many surprises, I don't know. But I do think it's interesting that, you know, when we get through the Kirk surrenders, he's arrested, he's put on trial, you know, you get General Worf defending him. And I've always wondered about this, because I know Worf from Next Generation, but I really didn't know that he had any real background aside from his childhood, because they don't touch on it too much in Next Generation. So this is pre-Starfleet Worf, as far as I can tell. He's General Worf, so it leads me to believe that he is somehow involved with the Klingon army. They address him as General Worf. So, I don't know. I've always wondered about this. Like, I know they were kind of shoehorning Next Generation character in there, but
I thought that was his grandfather or something.
I think it might be part of his lineage. Yeah, I'm not sure what.
It's part of his lineage. It's not actually Worf.
Okay, it just happens to also be Michael Dorn.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that was the joke. You know, we'll have Michael Jordan play his own grandfather or father. I think Eric or Lord Uther is right. I think he was a little bit up on the family tree there with that one, but again, what a distinctive voice.
Okay, well that makes more sense now.
I think the idea too was that would also help, in a sense, kind of lead Worf into Starfleet, right? Because here's his granddaddy defending, you know, Kirk and McCoy. At least that was my thought process when I saw it. But it's not him personally. It's a relative, I believe.
Gotcha. Well, that would explain, because isn't his father's supposedly killed and his grandfather's killed at the Khitomer Massacre, which takes place after the Khitomer Accords. So I guess I never made the connections there, but that makes perfect sense. And it's interesting that they played that as like a joke, Worf playing Worf, but it's not really Worf. See, youngins like me, we missed out on that.
Right, you youngin.
And I haven't read the canon, the head story on it, so I don't know what the background of Worf's family tree is. Again, another reason, and I think we've talked about it in every single episode so far, this is why they need to do a Captain Worf show. Like, I don't want them to miss the boat like they did with Captain Sulu. And even, we'll talk about this in the next episode, if we continue with the movies, if we decide to go in a different direction with Generations, they had another Captain Sulu that they could have tapped, and they didn't do that either, and I'm still a little upset about it. But to bring us back, of course, to this film in particular, I really think it's interesting because Star Trek V did really focus a lot on McCoy, and I think that has carried over somewhat to this film, and I say that because he's very much a supporting character, but it's fleshing out this frustration with, again, he wasn't able to save somebody in a major crisis, a major important moment. And, you know, I know he's just sort of there to be Kirk's moral support and things like that. And, you know, it's maybe not an intentional portion of the story, but I think this is a nice rounding out of something from Star Trek V that was a holdover, in that I think McCoy is a lot more graceful with accepting his failure, if you will, with not being able to save, you know, the Klingon High Chancellor.
And DeForest plays that well in the trial sequence where, you know, he's being badgered by Chang on cross-examination, and it's a really nice moment, you know, that I tried to save him, man. Don't you get it? You know, and that was a very nice moment for him to do that.
And I brought this up, last episode. I just feel like DeForest Kelley is so underrated when it comes to the three of them. I mean, because of his acting skill, he's able to get that. Sorry, my dogs are so excited about this episode right now. They keep barking and running around upstairs because they're like, "Well, you guys just finished so we can listen." But with all that being said, yeah, that's right. Thank you, very good. But I feel like again he's such obviously an important piece of that trifecta in a sense, and he's able to show off his great acting chops, and I know we're bringing it up again, but he'd been an actor for what 40 or 50 years at this point, and he just I feel like this was a good way. Not just for him, it was a good way for all of them to go out in a sense. Like, this was the proper send-off, which I finally feel like... I shouldn't say that about Picard, because I did like the last episode of Next Generation. I gotta think about that one some more. Anyway.
We'll get to that eventually.
We'll get to that. That's right.
I agree. I think this is a great way to take that original series and give it a nice... ride into the sunset. We're not quite there yet with the story of this film yet, but I think it's a good segue, because getting back to our Russian discussion, they literally say the word gulag when they get to the prison. And I will say, okay, so my favorite movie when I was a kid, and it's one of my favorites today, was Street Fighter. And I always think of the prison scene and the fighting. And when they're in the gulag, it's very similar. And I feel like every Star Trek since Star Trek 6 has had a gulag scene like this. I think of Harry Kim and Tom Paris in Voyager. Every time I see this movie, I think they did it better on Voyager, if I'm being perfectly honest, because they were younger guys and they could have fights and tear at each other and scream at each other. Whereas Kirk and McCoy are like, all right, we got to figure out a way to get the hell out of here. And... I mean, it's immediate that there's like a path out. And I feel a little cheated by that in a way, because I would have liked to see Kirk one last time whoop wholesale ass against some badass alien. And instead we kind of get this like almost beaten Kirk. And I know it's setting up a redemption arc for later in the movie, of course, as it did in Star Trek 2. But I really feel like, one, it did a good thing with flipping the whole Kirk falling for the sex symbol and getting himself into trouble on its head. And two, it kind of fell short on and made him look a little weak. But I think while I'm disappointed by that, because I'm just a fanboy and I want to see Kirk whoop ass, I think it's a beautiful part of the story, because later on you see that two can play at the game of snake in the grass, and I'll kind of leave it at that, because then we get into the whole like shapeshifter scene, and I thought that was really cheesy back in the day. Saw Terminator 2 first, so of course, the sword through the head while you're on the phone has always stuck with me. Like, nothing is better than that. But I think the whole setup there, where you kind of get the truth revealed to you. Again, to me, it's a little obvious. You kind of knew something like this was probably coming, but I think it's really interesting how it sets it up, and the ruse becomes a double ruse. So, I'm so curious to hear what you guys think, because I think when you see it later on, and if you've seen other movies that have copied the trope, it kind of cheapens the original. But in the moment, in the day, what was this gulag sequence like for you guys, and the turnaround when they get beamed back? What? Because to me, it blew my mind when I was like 5, but like now I look at it, I'm like, well, yeah, okay. But in the moment, take it away.
APC, go ahead.
Yeah, the Rura Pente, I think, is what they actually ended up naming it there. Yep. Ice Planet Hoth, or Alaska, or whatever we were calling it. It's funny because
Chicagoland.
Yeah, the thing I remember the most about it, again, sitting in a theater, was that this particular Star Trek film, of all the original 6, had the most what I would call guest stars, or people who came into this with previous acting histories or baggage or characters, or
great
we'd
point.
seen them before. And whether that was Kim Cattrall or Christopher Plummer or on Rua Pente, Iman, David Bowie's wife, supermodel wife, who had a bit part in a Kevin Costner thriller I really liked in '87, No Way Out, and then later a surprise guest on the Excelsior, and Kurtwood Smith from RoboCop playing the Federation president. Again, as a young film student sitting there watching it, I was constantly sort of being pulled out because I'm like, oh, there's Iman, or oh, there's Kim Cattrall, or oh, they weren't necessarily, like the Robin Curtises or people that I wasn't familiar with doing this. They were people that I had previously watched and enjoyed in other roles, so that was interesting. As we're doing the Gulag sequence, we're also cutting back with Spock and everybody looking for the gravity boots and doing the Agatha Christie, put all the clues together. So I like the back and forth on it in terms of how they're keeping us. This is something that, at least from my experience, we hadn't seen in Star Trek. Sort of the figure out the Sherlockian Holmes locked room. How did they fire the torpedoes? How did they get back on board the ship? Where did they hide it? How did they not set a phaser off? And, all these little things they're playing with, and then we're cutting back to these two, and it does have that sort of Genesis planet. Again, you can probably credit or blame Nicholas Meyer for it. He kind of reused one of his old tricks there, where it looks like they're going to get captured or get caught, but he and Spock have worked this out already, and just by a quick turn of phrase and a well-placed transporter beam, everybody's safe. So I didn't mind it. I didn't feel cheated on it. As you referred to it as a trope, that's fine. It was satisfying to me because we still, even as they're beamed to safety, we still don't have the final pieces of that puzzle to put it all together. I mean, we have evidence and clues and so forth, but we have not yet seen the whole picture, which is coming in the next sequence when they get back on board the ship there, which is a sequence I'm sure we'll talk about. But that's where I came down on it.
Yeah, I do agree that we knew they were going to get away. I agree with that. The first time I saw it, I was like, holy, like, how did they know to beam him out? When you see it afterwards, you do see the point where Spock puts his hand on Kirk's back and places. Yeah, which now you could be like, well, the Klingons didn't see this thing on his back and didn't, but whatever. If that's the biggest flaw of this movie, I'll take it, quite honestly. So, yeah, they were going to get away. And Aaron, that's a great point about going back and forth between, what was happening on the planet and what was happening on the ship as they were figuring all that out. I also think the dynamic between Spock and Valeris is very important because there is the romantic piece at the beginning, in my opinion. I thought there was a romantic piece between the two of them. Did you feel that way, Cody? That there was a little bit of... See, I thought he was in love with her.
Mentor-student. I mean,
was it?
Okay. I was getting mentor-student as well.
So that's based off of... It's almost like the Police song, Don't Stand So Close to Me. But anyway, so there's... Sorry.
Now that's a music video I wouldn't mind seeing somebody on YouTube make. Of all those FMVs out there, let's get that made. I want to see a
Spock and Valeris.
A Spock and Valeris little
Don't stand so close.
Little romantic. Don't stand so close to me.
That's right, but sorry, I thought he was in love with her. So that's kind of weird. Anyway, he's almost like proud of her as she's like figuring all these things out and bringing it up. So I thought it was I didn't see it coming when I saw the movie that she was going to be one of the bad guys. I ain't gonna lie, I didn't see that wind up. That was going to happen because how could a Vulcan do that? Was my thought when I saw it, because Vulcans were always so altruistic and were such so bonded with the Federation. But I think it goes back to the point I brought up earlier about you're going to just have people set in their ways and believe it's never going to be any better, which we could apply that to any point in human history, or quite honestly, United States history, if we want to get into that too, that people are set, we don't have to, that people are set in their ways and they're not going to see something else, even though it's better, because they're brought up on this belief system that just can never be modified or changed, even though they know it should be, right? And in my blog I'm going to write this week, I'm actually going to talk about turning 50 and having some wisdom to be able to get away from being set in your ways and being open to other things, because I think that's a part of wisdom, and that's a part of growing, is knowing that things can change no matter how hard or how set in your ways you are. And I think that goes to show that Valeris was obviously very set in her ways and had a belief system, but Vulcans were supposed to do that in a sense, be the bad guy. And so that's why I thought that was kind of cool that she winds up kind of being one of the bad guys in the long run, because it shouldn't have been like that. And then for Spock to actually have to mind probe her to get that out, to see what had happened, I thought that was also a very tense scene that again was just another great piece of this movie. Incredible
acting in that scene too, and that mind meld. I always thought.
Aaron,
oh, go ahead.
No, it was just to what Urza Master was.
Just say my name. It's fine.
Probably going to say the physical violation of that moment. Like, you don't want to diminish things or call them there, but like we'll call it a physical assault almost. The mental assault.
That's
and
a
I know
good point.
That Star Trek later used this in the next gen films in one that Lord Uther wasn't fond of. But for the first time seeing something that was, I don't want you in here, and it's necessary for me to take that information from you by force, basically. The thing I wanted to bring up earlier was that it had always been the original plan for Valeris to be Saavik. That was Nicholas Meyer, and he and Gene Roddenberry fought viciously over this. He wanted Saavik to be the one who was part of the conspiracy, and he wanted to kind of finish her story and put some meat on that bone as far as
that would have been
amazing. And I would have been very, very, very conflicted in the moment, and perhaps even watching it later, if that was true, because again, my impressions of Saavik as portrayed by Robin Curtis and in Kirstie Alley, like I said, she was on Team Federation, and to have that sort of corrupted or twisted or altered in some form like that would have left me with a real sense of ambiguity and so forth. It ended up that they Kim Cattrall, when they went to cast her, she didn't want to play someone else's role. So they changed the name, and they may have done a little bit of tweaking in the writing. But if you go back and watch that film again now, and just when in that first scene that Eric or Lord Uther is saying about, is he have a crush on her or whatever, and we're reading it as mentor-student. If you read that as Saavik, the lines that they say it's almost identical. Like it's almost the continuation of the conversations that they were having in Star Trek II and so forth like that. And so that was very interesting to me. But that scene right there, that's a dangerous scene for a Star Trek audience in that moment. You've got the underscore, you've got the way it's shot, and he's very slowly getting revealing each member of the conspiracy and how far the rot goes, into the very roots of Starfleet. And like I say, that's that 70s paranoid thriller that we were talking about, where it just, it sends chills. The first time you see it and you don't know what's coming, it actually will give you chills, because it's like, I haven't seen this before. Spock is like, he stalks towards her. He's got this look on his face, is very un-Vulcan, like, I'm going to take this from you, whether, and you're not going to stop me.
Yeah, it definitely, it was a shocking moment. Seeing that the first time. Seeing it now, it's like I'm ready for it. When you're not prepared for that particular style of mind meld, it's intense. The one thing, and I hate to keep bringing up things I wish they would have done, in lieu of not being able to round out Savik's story here, because I think Next Generation does a really nice job with like having some corruption within, the Federation. I always thought, and now seeing Picard, I'm so glad they did this. I always thought, how badass would it be if it was a Romulan, because they look like Vulcans, a Romulan Tal Shiar, who Valeris ends up being. And you find out that this was a Romulan plot to put Klingon versus Federation to take advantage from the Romulan Empire. I thought that would have been amazing. I don't think at the time there were enough bones there to kind of set that up. I really hope nobody ever reboots these movies. I really, really hope that. But if they did, if you laid the foundation for that in a 6-movie story arc and brought it back as like, okay, it's a Tal Shiar involvement, and now you have this galactic war set up, would be pretty damn intense. I'm not a real big fan, like Lord Uther, of the alternate universes and timelines, but if they were going to do a Star Trek 4, like they keep talking about, here's a way they could possibly do it. And so, for me, the big reveal and the lead into the next assassination attempt in this movie, it feels really James Bond. And I love James Bond. I'm going to put that out there now. Of course, Sean Connery is my James Bond. Nothing against Roger Moore or Daniel Craig, even Pierce Brosnan. Everything against George Lazenby. But the 007 movies, I think, really informed, because this is a Cold War story, and this is a very, spy-type film in a lot of ways. I think they really informed how this end sequence was going to play out, and the assassination attempt on the president and all this stuff that was going to happen eventually. To me, it really felt like the perfect way to draw this story to a conclusion, other than, of course, the space battle we see. But, the space battle, I don't think at any point anybody watching this movie, whether it's the first time or the 1000th time, I don't think anybody was ever like, oh, wow, I didn't expect it to go like this. I completely expected that epic battle in space to happen. And it's about fucking time. 6 movies in, we finally get a good ship-to-ship battle. Nothing against Star Trek 2, but it wasn't as good.
And seeing it take the torpedoes, the Enterprise, like I wince, like it's a family member. It's like they shoot a close torpedo through the nacelle, the saucer, and you're just like, oh. So that's, I agreed. It was a great staging.
Yeah. So, I mean, you kind of get the best of both worlds here. You get the best of Star Trek, and then you get the best of the rest of the story of this movie, which is your James Bond, James Kirk. And I fucking love it. I mean, I have to say that, there's so much I love about every Star Trek movie, even the comparatively not as good ones. But I think the thing I love about it most, and not to be ageist, but the cast visibly ages tremendously in these 6 movies. And for those old farts to be saving the universe.
One more time
in 007, like spy fashion, with some real kind of underhanded techniques, some brutality in the mind meld, and, breaking from their traditional characters to kind of make all of this happen and bring it to this nice punch of an ending. It's just like, oh man.
It's kind of...
I think it's the payoff we've all been waiting for.
Like, it's a cool metamorphosis when you think about it. Because going off of what Aaron said about it being a 12, there's this 12-year gap. So how old were they when they did motion picture, Aaron? Were they in their late 40s? Early 50s?
I've got to think that the youngest were mid to late 30s, if we're... I hadn't...
Because Shatner's 90 now.
Shatner's probably 41 or so, somewhere in there. And then, because he's doing
so
Jay Hooker on TV at the same time.
That's right. So to see them go from, or even see him go from being that, like you're saying, Cody, from this, you know, put your dukes up kind of thing to, I mean, yeah, at the end he does the diving Ronnie Lott tackle and takes down the guy to save him, whatever, you know, but for them to go from being physical to more of the cerebral, that's a pretty interesting point. But because they couldn't physically do it, I mean, even in 5, when they're trying to like run away from, it's so obvious that they've got stunt double. There's no way they were going to run away from the ship. And then you kind of see William Shatner like shuffling along at one point. But again, I'm going to say understandably so, because the dudes were older. I mean, totally understand that. But it brings me to, first of all, I think the space battle was epic. I agree with you. Now, I'm still a lover of Wrath of Khan, whether it was the initial Khan-Kirk fight or in the Mutara Nebula, which is very submarine-y, like Aaron was talking about, you know, using the different depths and things like that in the second one. But my favorite line, when they're flying and the Excelsior is shaking and, you know, in range, and just... That's the other thing. Takei's voice, you know, in range, the way he says it, and whatever they said, how long away, and, you know, fly her apart then. That is one of my favorite lines in any Star Trek movie. For multiple reasons. First of all, in real life, George Takei would have said, stop the ship, I don't care what happens to William Shatner, because they hate each other. But here's... Acting. Yes, that is acting. But here's Loyal Sulu saying, if this ship falls apart, I don't care what it's going to take. We're gonna get there, right? Like we're gonna help them out. We need to be there. And I think the performance he delivers too in this movie, I think it's, and he's not even in it that much. Even when he beams down to the planet and he takes out his phaser and he's like, you know, he says something like, "Hold it right there," or something like that as he points his phaser at somebody. He delivers his lines so well in this movie for the limited amount of time he's in there.
And he put Christian Slater in his place for interrupting.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Thank you. Forgot about that. Which goes back to your point of, yeah, all these people being in this movie before that, all these top-notch actors that we really hadn't seen. I mean, Ricardo Montalban was.
Right.
Right?
I think they all...
So I yeah, without a doubt. So yeah, the space battle was awesome. Again, like you said, saving it in a James Bond type of way, again, was fantastic. Christopher Plummer delivering his lines, like Aaron had said, you know, spinning around in his seat, you know, cry havoc, the dogs of war, or whatever it was, and then he's like he's just firing all these torpedoes. You know, he just wants to blow the Enterprise up, and he wants him to suffer. Though I think he wants to. It's like he's punishing Kirk, right? We're going to send one here, someone there. There's nothing they can do about it. And, of course, you know, Spock and McCoy come up. Sorry, Urza, I think I kind of stole your thunder because usually you're explaining the movie at this point. But I'm so jazzed up about it. And then you've got just, like, it makes me emotional thinking about it. But you've got the torpedo, you know, they get the torpedo, and you've got two guys who have been at each other's throats for decades. And they're the ones that are going to make it happen. And they're doing surgery together on this torpedo to make it be able to track down Chang's ship. You know, it's locked and loaded, Jim. That's another line that is just, it brings like the chills to you with McCoy delivering that line. And, yeah, it just, the end... I know I keep saying this, but just what a way! It's like they sent them out the right way, not like in Nemesis.
Yeah. That's a great comparison. Now, if I can, bring everyone on a ride, as I want to do. Come along with me on this ride. I love Shakespeare, and I love movies that quote and cite Shakespeare or build it into their story. And I've always felt that this movie used Shakespeare very well and in a very similar manner to another one of my favorite movies, which, unfortunately, like a Star Trek V, was pretty heavily panned. But I've always felt that there's some copycat between General Chang and Kirk, and I can't believe I'm bringing this up, but I have to because it's right here, and if I don't say it, I'm going to regret it. What do you guys think about Kirk being Kevin Costner in The Postman, and Chang being the other guy, the villain in The Postman? Both the actor's name and the character's name escape me. General.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Something, but it's very Shakespearean. It's very dystopian. I think so. It's been so long, but yeah. So I've always thought that it's like, because I love The Postman. I still do. I know it's not a great film. It's a good film. I like it. I think it's underrated, but I think that they borrowed thematic and character elements from Star Trek 6, and it's no more evident than it is in the Shakespeare, except they flip it. They make Kirk's character more of, I mean, literally a Shakespearean actor, but more of the sort of cerebral, not necessarily snake in the grass, but like the pacifist, and they kind of merge. And I've always wondered, if you take Kirk and Spock and combine them, you were going to make this uber Star Trek character. Would it be Kevin Costner's Postman? Because he's cerebral, he's logical, he's non-violent as much as he can be, but isn't afraid to be when he needs to. To me, I don't know. I know this is for a Star Trek podcast. This is getting out in the weeds, but I have always thought that if you took the best of Kirk, the best of Spock, you would get the Postman, and you put him up against a General Chang, who also kind of has the best of Khan in the sense that he's kind of a Nazi. He's sort of, trying to create this Ubermensch mentality where the strongest leads the pack. You're putting two great villains against two great heroes, and I don't know. Maybe I'm reaching, but I don't know. Have you guys ever thought of this comparison?
It's up to Aaron. I've never seen The Postman, and by the way, it is Will Patton. I just looked it up, but I'll let APC take it because I haven't seen The Postman.
Yeah, I tell you what, I owe Lord Uther a movie for Excalibur, so I will mail you a copy of The Postman on Blu-ray if they ever made it, and if not, I have a VHS tape with your name on it.
Oh, great!
Wow. So of course, we've kind of talked through basically the whole film at this point, but the ending of this movie and the end of what is effectively Star Trek as an original series, as an original movie series. Because from here on out, whenever we see these characters again, it's in a completely different context or a different timeline, which we will, I'm sure, we'll eventually have to talk about those movies. Lord Uther's like, can we push that out to like 2028? Or I think you've given them the perfect sort of oddball real world foil with the spy film, and you've given them the perfect space battle. You've set up the future, the next generation, if you will, but you're also giving them kind of the moment too, just in the way they round out this movie, literally riding off into the sunset, basically. For me, it felt complete, and I say that because in so many sci-fi movies, the end of the movie feels very incomplete. I even think of Return of the Jedi. I felt very incomplete at the end of the movie. I felt like there's a lot left unresolved. There's still a whole ass empire that they have not really addressed. They've killed two dudes, and blown up yet another Death Star because you blow one up, there's just another one in space dock, right? What about these Ewoks? Like, come on now. Anyway, so but I mean, you could bring up any sci-fi movie. What was the Firefly one? Serenity. Of course, the series left us hanging. The movie left us hanging, and there's still so much, like, this is the first sci-fi movie I can remember, and the only one I can remember, that I actually feel like they've tied up everything. Like, they really, if I didn't know they were going to give us more from these characters later, they really didn't have to bring back anybody. We never needed to see the Enterprise C in Generations.
B.
We didn't ever need to see that. Yeah, or
B.
B, or I forget which one it was, but that was something that I'm glad we got more of them, because I always want more. I'm a fanboy, but it's so nice, and I go back. It's a testament to the writing. It's so nice to see that in a sci-fi movie, and I want to know from those who were there at the time, did this feel final, or did it feel like there were open doors for you guys?
Yeah. Go ahead. Aaron. One of the reasons why I love doing these podcasts is it just so many things I've really never thought of before, kind of are brought up, and hopefully, and I know for sure that's what we're doing for our fans as well when we're having these conversations. But Aaron, that's something I never really thought about until you just brought it up now, that the score was, I know we keep using this term, it was a darker score. It was a brutal's the wrong word. Let's stick with dark. It was a darker score until the very end. But if there's one thing you've taught me over the years, Aaron, and I mean, you're one of the people. You are the person that got me into just loving movie soundtracks and really taking, the music in the movie setting the tone for different things. That's the one you really taught me that, and I have a real appreciation for it. But I had never really thought about it. I mean, when it comes to Star Trek 6, I never thought about it until you brought that up, that it was a very downtrodden soundtrack and didn't have that hope that I think Star Trek, that's the thing, one of the things I always loved about Star Trek. Go ahead. It's an awesome point. Cody, you and I have talked about it. The only thing, and this is what drove me crazy about Generations. There's a way I wanted Kirk to go out, which I guess when we talk about Generations, we'll have that conversation, because that's the only thing that I did not like about that movie when it came to Generations. Kirk, look, we brought up Serenity, right? We brought up the show Serenity, and one of the reasons why I love that show is because that guy, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, the character in the show, but Mal.
Nathan Fillion.
Mal,
yeah.
He's Kirk. I mean, he's Kirk, and that's why I love that show so much, because he's got that swagger and that that aura about him that Kirk had, and that's why I thought he should have went out a certain way. Otherwise, which we'll talk about when we get to Generations, to me it was the right way to go. It was the right way to send off the crew. Yeah, we're going to see a couple of them again, or 3 of them again, in Generations, and then we're going to see him a little bit in. Oh yeah, Enterprise of the Captain B. Yeah. And we're going to see Save Ferris, but and then we're going to obviously see a couple of these guys in Next Generation episodes. We're going to see Leonard Nimoy one more time in the new Star Trek movies, but it was the right way to send off all those that cast, right? It was the right way to end it. I don't think you could have done it any better. I really don't. Yeah, their signatures. That was a cool thing. That's a good point.
Very
that was
cool.
A cool thing at the end too. But to see my beloved Enterprise go off into the sunset,
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap Star Trek 6. I mean, we've kind of beat a dead horse on it a little bit because it is so good, and I think if I'm going to leave it with one last thought, the most interesting thing about Star Trek 6 is it was so successful, so impactful, and so incredible that it was noted in my German textbook when I was in high school as Star Trek 6 Das Unbekannte Land. So, yeah,
Wow.
that and UB40 also mentioned in that same textbook. So, on par.
close. Yeah.
So the question is now, we have gone through all of the original series films in our first 6 episodes, which I think is the perfect place to start a Star Trek podcast. That's my opinion, and it's correct.
Yes, it is.
But now it begs the question, do we, as the Warp Core podcast will soldier on beyond this Enterprise iteration, do we now move to the Next Generation films, or do we go back and do the original series show, or do we jump to something modern and tackle Strange New Worlds? Because we've talked a couple of different things, and I think as a service to our listeners and our fans, and we've got RJ Macready here with us today who can maybe break a tie on this, where do we take the Warp Core from here? Because we have an opportunity. We could roll into Generations, but I feel like when we get to Nemesis, where do you go from there? And if we don't do that, and we go back to the original series and watch that whole thing, do we then go animated series? And then where do you go from there? Do you jump to Next Generation? Or, but if we go Strange New Worlds, that's very vogue. So I think there's a lot of possibility here. And I've been waiting to ask this question because it's been itching at my mind like one of those little earwig worms. And I'm open to suggestion.
Aaron, have you seen Strange New Worlds? Of course you have. Why am I even asking you that question? Oh my You haven't seen Picard yet? Oh. Oh, my. Oh, my. Got no spoilers. Picard's Picard, because Picard season 2 starts February, or season 3 starts February 13th, I believe, and there's a definite surprise with that you're gonna have to, which you probably already know about because I know you read all the trades and all that kind of stuff. Wow, interesting. All right. And that the one that Spock designed, and that's the conversation that coding. I mean, Aaron, when you see Strange New Worlds, it from the episode, the first episode, like it doesn't take 3 seasons. I mean, there's only been 1 season, and you're just wrapped right into it. And I know this is going off on a little bit of a tangent. It's that good. It's that
first 10 minutes.
Oh my god!
First 10 minutes. I mean, they didn't even need a full episode. Now it was hook, line, and sinker.
There was not a weak episode at all. There was not a weak episode the entire season. It's amazing.
I heard about that.
That's supposed to be drawn.
No further. Oh God,
Right.
I want to. Oh.
All right, let's go. Let's at least do this. Let's go next gen movies, and if I'll send Aaron the. Oh, we will go toe to toe on Nemesis because that could. Well, I can rip on it as much as I can't stand Phantom Menace, so it's gonna be right there. Oh my God! I love you, but Jesus. All right, next gen's the next one, and then I'll send Aaron the $10 so he can get Paramount, and then he'll get all caught up, and he can watch all those while we do the next gens. I think that's a plan. All right, Urza, take us out, brother.
All right, so our next episode, episode 7, will be Star Trek 7. Coming in a week, we have Star Trek Generations, my personal favorite of all Star Trek films. So I'm looking at the DVD right now on my shelf. Like, if there was a word greater than excited, I'm triple that. So, as always, we appreciate you coming with us in the Warp Core podcast. We've taken you out. We've made it so. And next week, we are going to scan for you little life forms. I'm so excited.
I love that one. Yeah.
Oh, I love it so much. So, with that, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed our other videos, please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, drop us a comment with any thoughts you have on this show or other shows we've done. We have a lot of great content coming to our YouTube channel, Digital Escape Podcast. You can see us at digitалescapepod.com for all of our latest content. That's the Digital Escape Podcast, the Warp Core Podcast, the brand new Melt Off Podcast, hosted by myself and Goonie Mama. And, of course, all of our other goodies that we drop. You may find some shorts, you may find some reels of varying types. We've got open boxes coming up. We've got a fuel saver video where I talk about how I just saved so much money on gas. I spent 25 cents per gallon on my latest tank. And all kinds of other goodies. I mean, we have no end of nerdy, goofy,
Yes.
Midwestern weirdness, and we're going to share it with you. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Notification button is great on YouTube. You will get notified of all of our latest episodes. And again, we will see you next time. And as just one final farewell to our original series crew with Star Trek VI, a great send-off. May those who are no longer with us rest in peace. May George Takei and William Shatner eventually bury the hatchet. And may they please make a Captain Sulu show. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.